Welcome to a special bonus episode from Bring Back V10s to get you in the mood ahead of our return for season 11 in the new year. Today, we're celebrating the end of our full season look back at 1997, which we've been doing in the Race Members Club with a mini episode on each of the 17 races. Our trip through the year has finished now, but we weren't ready to say goodbye to 1997 just yet, so we thought we'd finish off by debating the top 10 drivers of that season. To do that, Ed Straw, Ben Anderson and Matt Beer are here with me, Glenn Freeman. And if listening to all this chat about 1997 gives you a taste for looking back at that season in full, then check out the link in the description of this episode to head to our Patreon, where you can sign up and go back through the full season with us. And if you're not sure about fully signing up yet, each episode is also available to buy individually for a one-off price. So why not check out a race you're particularly interested in and then sign up to get the rest if you like what you hear. As usual with our top 10s, the way we've done this is to each do our own top 10 lists, which have then been scored using the current F1 point system, and the combined scores are used to give us our top 10. And before we get going, Ben, anyone who has followed this series closely will know that you've managed to shoehorn Damon Hill into every single episode. But I'm going to give away right now that Damon wasn't in your top 10. So there was no attempt to make sure that we talk about him here. I would call that a disgraceful lack of loyalty. And I've let you off the hook, really, by bringing Damon up at this stage. So explain yourself.
Oh, well, I'm sorry, Damon, and I'm sorry, everyone. I really wanted him to be in the top 10.
Number one.
Well, of course. Even just squeezing into the top 10, the crapshoot that always is the 10th position, but I just couldn't do it. When I look back at everyone's season, and I've done a lot of top 10 lists in my time in F1, so I can't help but take them a little bit seriously, and I just couldn't justify it based on two peaks. Hungary, if the championship was just Hungary, he'd be in the top 10, but apart from that and the qualifying in Jerez, you could, if you were Murray Walker-esque patriotic, you might justify Silverstone, the race to 6th, but it was attritional. So no, just not enough. It was an underwhelming season from Damon, and he would accept that.
It's the Shinji Nakano moment at Imola. That's the bit that just keeps bringing back to my mind.
Yeah, I was going to have to say exactly this to Ben. I was already warming up pre-episode going, I'm just going to shout 2 good qualifying sessions, 1 good race. That's all there was to it. But no, Ben has said that already, so there's no need to mention that. All the times he got out-qualified by Pedro Diniz, all wandering into Nakano. Ben's done it all. We can stop the episode.
And going to sleep against Michael Schumacher in Austria as well. As the car got better, Diniz got too close. It was, just objectively a bad season from Damon. I mean, he was close, though. I could have justified putting him 12th if the rankings were the full grid, but not top 10.
Well, there we go, because my follow-up question was going to be, are you going to do the cop-out thing and go, he was number 11, which whenever we do these top 10s, I'm sure Ed has about 5 number 11s, which is just his way of going, I wanted to include everybody. But you've hit upon something I found quite interesting there, Ben, which was that the more we sort of scratched at the surface of Damon's season, the more we found other things, other than the bits that he's particularly remembered for. We found other things that Damon did that were a little bit disappointing. But let's crack on with the drivers who did get in then. And in 10th place, and it was a pretty comfortable 10th, actually, ahead of a handful of stragglers who were, chosen by at least one of us but didn't make the cut. So the first driver we come to is Rubens Barrichello. Barrichello, of course, led Stewart in its first season in F1, which we've covered in full on Bring Back V10s. He claimed that unforgettable podium finish in Monaco, which would be the team's only points finish of the year in a debut campaign that was blighted by unreliability. Ben and Ed had Rubens 8th, Matt had him 9th, and I didn't include him, but he was very close for me putting him in as well. So I'll play the 11th place card here as well. He was on the fringe along with a couple of other guys. Ben, was Rubens an easy pick for you?
Yeah, he was. Obviously, it was a bad season points-wise, but mainly down to the unreliability of the car. So I gave him a lot of credit for the qualifying speed. That was the thing that really impressed me. He was always kind of floating in sort of 11th, 12th on average, I think. And then obviously there were some really good peaks as well. So yeah, turn of speed, lack of points, but not really through any fault of his own. It's messy down the end of the grid. 97 was a season where everyone drove badly at points. But I think, with the tools at his disposal, Barrichello was quite impressive in that lower order.
Yeah, the peaks were really high. That's what got. I could have put him anywhere between 7th and 10th, really, because the Monaco podium, some of those qualifying laps, how often he was like an insane amount ahead of Jan Magnussen, who obviously didn't live up to his potential in F1 at all. But the qualifying margins were just absolutely nuts. You shouldn't be that far ahead of somebody who actually is talented, just wasn't making the most of that talent in F1. Because it was a new team, because it was the Bridgestone factor as well, there were lots of races where you could look at and go, was that loss of race pace just the tyres? Could Rubens have done more there? But no, overall, I think this is one of his best F1 seasons outright.
He also had the disadvantage of being in a new team, didn't he? So I think he led it very, very well. I did sort of flirt with putting him a little bit higher. There was the odd mistake during the season as well, but he did utterly batter Magnussen. I think this was a pretty strong all-round season and a chance for him to lead a team. Actually, he didn't have so many chances to do that in his F1 career, the way it panned out. But Stewart's first season story would be very different without Barrichello, I'd have thought.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And obviously, I highlighted that there were no more points after Monaco. But as we covered in our Stewart episode, and as came up a few times towards the end of the year in our 97 series, the Stewarts, even both of them by the end of the year, were turning up kind of in the top 10 in qualifying. They obviously had the great Austria race. Rubens, had to lead that team, and the car was quicker than one crazy wet Monaco points finish suggests. So good job, Rubens. In 9th place, we have Johnny Herbert, who finished 10th in the championship for Sauber, scoring points 6 times during the season and taking a podium finish that often gets forgotten in what we all know as the Damon Hill race in Hungary. Ben and Ed agreed with each other again on this one. They both put Johnny 9th. I had him 8th. Matt had him up in 6th. So Matt, tell us, what was so great about Johnny Herbert in 1997?
So there were two at the time. I would endlessly bang on about how good Heinz Harald Frentzen was being really and how good Johnny Herbert was being under the radar. One of those 1997 standpoints I've revisited quite heavily during this series. The Johnny Herbert
You may be challenged on that one again later.
Yeah, I can see that. The Johnny Herbert one, I actually still feel very positive about. I think it might. Can I argue it was his best F1 season outright? I'll give it a go. Yeah, I think it was. I think he got the Sauber in places that Sauber shouldn't have got. There were often races where he was doing things with the Goodyear tyres that were really, really kind of underrated at the time on days that weren't good Goodyear days. The Hungary podium being a really great example. I've still got a massive kind of what might have been feeling about Melbourne, where he was like somewhere between like 1st and 3rd going to the first corner as that mad start unfolded before Eddie Irvine harpooned everyone. And I know who goes fastest in the warm-up counts for absolutely nothing, but he went fastest in the warm-up that day, which suggests that car did have some race pace, even if it's just to run light on a different strategy and lead for a bit after a crazy start. How glorious would that have been? Sixth is high, I admit, but my strategy with most top 10s is to give myself about 45 seconds and then start a list of drivers and go, well, that person's more impressive than that person's less impressive than that person, and see what my order looks like at the end, and probably just file it and run. And by that count, I felt I could make quite a good vibes-based choice for Johnny Herbert's consistent decentness through the season, putting him ahead of a few people who were maybe had higher peaks but were annoyingly rubbish too many other times.
I don't think it's that ridiculous putting him up that high. I did have him bouncing around in the lower part of my top 10. Sort of almost, you can almost make a case for him even to slip in 5th or something. Such is the difficulty of it's one of the running themes of this season. There's a lot of drivers who none of them really make a ultimately compelling case to get a lot of those positions. I'd almost like to have left 5th, 6th, 7th blank or something. But Herbert was very strong. You mentioned that Hungary one. He was on the soft Goodyears in that race, managed them brilliantly. There was a bit of bad luck. Australia, Imola, I think, springs to mind. He was going well in Monaco, wasn't he? So I think it was a good, strong season. Demolished all 3 of his teammates, Morbidelli, Larini and Fontana. And yeah, just really made sure that Sauber had a strong season. So I think, yeah, you can make a case this was one of Herbert's strongest F1 seasons, and yeah, anywhere sort of quite well into the top 10, I think stands up.
adding to the chorus of agreement, I think he was the stealth hit, wasn't he, of this season? Impressive qualifying performances, getting amongst the sort of big 4 or 5, taking quite a few scalps. Not really many errors either. There were quite a few races where he was wiped out when he otherwise might have done better in terms of finishes. So yeah, I mean, I had him obviously 9th in my rankings, but actually did think to myself at the last minute, oh, you could make a case for him being higher. So I'm going to agree with Matt that actually anywhere from kind of 6th to 10th would be justified for Herbert.
The saddest thing about it in retrospect is I had such high hopes for him up against John Lacey at Sauber after that in 98, and it started so well for Herbert. He was ridiculously quicker than Lacey, and then he was absolutely terrible for most of 98. So that's probably why I think of this as Johnny Herbert's high point, because, okay, he won a race later on, but it was largely downhill after this in terms of impressive performances.
I think with Herbert, you always have the question mark over the qualifying pace, because after that F3000 crash, he never really had the absolute ability to get the maximum out of the car over a qualifying lap. He was pretty good in qualifying, but I suspect there was some untapped potential in that Sauber, certainly over a single lap. But his race performances were really strong, and he did turn in consistently good performances throughout his career. Actually, it's one of the challenging things with this top 10, because you try and dial out all that you subsequently know about the driver, if you see what I mean, but you also can't. Obviously, I know from speaking to Herbert now, he's quite frank about the qualifying struggles he had. Had I been covering 97 live as it was, maybe that wouldn't have been quite so evident. Maybe I'd have put him a place or two higher. So that's one of the difficult things to untangle. But yeah, I'm sure that there were other drivers who could have got more out of that car on Saturday. So that's sort of the one caveat to a very good season.
Well, I'm finding the level of agreement that we've had so far, even Ben holding his hands up and not really trying to defend Damon Hill, is all very off-brand for Bring Back V10s and his 97 series. But in 8th place in our combined ranking, we had a man who quite clearly split opinion between us, and that is Jean Alesi. Ed and I had Alesi 6th, Ben put him 10th, and Matt didn't include him. So, Ed, before we hear from the other two about why Lacey was rubbish, what got him up to 6th for you?
Actually, despite being John Lacey, very consistent. Completed the most laps of anyone, consistently scored well. There are a number of very good drives in amongst
reasonable number of podiums is what actually struck me when I look back at it.
5 podiums off the top of my head. Yeah, he had a decent season. There maybe perhaps weren't a few of the peaks. He had a few moments of madness, Austria and the Australia not pitting for fuel thing. But beyond that, there weren't too many. I think he had a spin at Monaco, but he was consistently there at the end. Monza was probably a race he could have won, but for what Pat Simmons later described as one of the most pathetic pit stops he'd seen in his life in terms of the driver's contribution. So, yeah, I actually looked at Lacey and my sort of natural inclination was to have him lower, but because there were so many drivers who were all over the shop, it was strangely Jean Alesi that provided a good bit of consistency in a Benetton that wasn't that good. So actually, his season was pretty decent. But the fact I had him so high, I think, also reflects how few people made a strong case to be in the upper echelons of the top 10. Let's put it that way. But I think in going through the numbers and the data and considering everything and what he did in the year, it was a better year than maybe I had kind of in my mind. But still not good enough, and there was a lot more untapped potential in the Lacey. Really probably should have won a race or two, but yeah, a good year if tinged with an undercurrent of a Lacey madness.
Yeah, I was surprised actually. I went into this process thinking Lacey, he's going to have to kind of, which is I assume where Ben and Matt got to, he's going to have to work quite hard to get in here. And I sort of looked at his results. I looked at the inconsistency of everyone else, and I thought, I can't really ignore that. And I feel that probably that Benetton wasn't that good a car. So I ended up kind of giving him the benefit of the doubt that although there were some Jean Alesi moments, I don't think he necessarily wasted a great car. But Matt, I do want to come to you next. Was Alesi your token 11th place pick, or was he absolutely miles away for you?
It was never a consideration for the top 10. And even when I kind of got to him in the list, in my kind of mental list of who I'm putting where, I hadn't checked it, and I was like, I feel like he finishes quite high up in the championship, but he does it really boringly. And it didn't even shift my opinion when I kind of look back and went, oh yeah, loads of podiums. And was he 4th in the end, but in the Schumacher list points? Which is actually, that's fine. I'm not going to say great, that's fine. I had a really strong nagging feeling throughout Alesi's 97 that he just wasn't actually he wasn't delivering the peaks. He was delivering the troughs and then the mediocre stuff in the middle. But he wasn't giving you the peak. He wasn't maximising the car on the days it could have actually done something in the way that Gerhard Berger did once and Alesi could have done a couple of times. And yeah, there were days when I thought, oh, okay, that's a day I thought Alesi would destroy the tyres, and he didn't. And I've got a little bit of respect for that. But
he had a few really good tyre management races, actually.
Yeah.
Canada, I want to say.
Yeah, that rings a bell. But the mistakes were particularly bad, even by Jean Alesi standards, and the missed chances like Monza were just so limp. It was a bit like his spirit had gone, which I understand, given how his Benetton stint was going after all the hope he had going there. So a little bit like not putting Damon in. I understand why Damon was rubbish. I would have been rubbish going for the World Championship to that car. So a bit of sympathy for him, but it just didn't. So many of my list is based on people who had enough good moments to outweigh their bad. Alesi had enough really bad moments to outweigh his moderately okay, I would say.
He had fewer bad moments than a lot of them, I would say, which slightly surprised me. Aside from those two spectacularly bad moments on that pit stop, it's a really weird season, isn't it? It's just a bizarre profile for a Jean Alesi season.
I think when you're trying to identify the most consistent driver and it turns out to be Jean Alesi, then something's going
says a lot.
That's
says
a
lot
reflection
about
of the season, not Alesi though.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I mean, he only made the bottom of my list almost by default. He was kind of best of the properly underwhelming drivers, I would say. And I think he was artificially a bit high in the points because, yeah, he was getting to the end, but a lot of those podiums were kind of lucky podiums thanks to other people messing up or, just having some unreliability. And it's the peaks that he should have maximised, like not winning Monza, reversing down the order at Spa when he's on the front row. I just think that was particularly disappointing. And I suspect there was more in that car than either he or Gerhard Berger showed.
He was about the 7th fastest driver in qualifying in what was probably the 4th best car. So it's sort of, I think pace-wise, he was about where he should be. It's nothing spectacular, but that's kind of the right sort of vicinity.
He's also one of the most experienced drivers too. I just think you expect a bit more from him.
Well, I wondered if that's why you guys marked him down. He underperformed against the kind of lofty expectations we all had of Jean Alesi by 1997, whereas perhaps I looked at it going, I've reappraised Alesi over the years since, and I've kind of gone, that season was fine.
Well, I think there's also an element of Wirtz coming in the middle of the year when Berger was unwell and just kind of taking it to Alesi, and he didn't really have anything left in the tank to kind of respond to that. So I just feel like he was kind of not really at the races, and Wirtz was a big part of exposing that.
Yeah, Wirtz is a really big factor in this for me as well, because I'm not going to say that Wirtz was never any good, because he clearly was, and his F1 career clearly showed his junior career hadn't really been representative. But Wirtz was not a superstar, and he looked like a superstar being right up with Alesi straight away. And that just really shone a poor light on Alesi. And also, Ben, you mentioned going backwards at Spa. We had some epic wet races in 97. Where was Alesi in those wet races? That's where you look to him to do something Suzuka 95 level glorious. And Schumacher was giving everyone a lesson in wet weather driving, and Alesi was reversing down the field or shunting.
The big problem is, though, that there's so many of these sort of asterisks against drivers in that season. There's so many of them.
And you've ignored the Alesi one.
Well, no, but
you've got to pick someone's flaws to ignore, because otherwise you have nobody in the bottom half of your top 10.
When you look at it you look at it in terms of number of flaws, and you think of it, actually, he put together a fairly consistent year, which a hell of a lot of them really, really didn't. It's not his ranking was, I think, 6. It wasn't the strong 6. I would expect a higher level from someone who gets that high, but that's the nature of this season. It's just it's profoundly difficult. I'm not exaggerating when I say I'd like to have left a few blanks. It's like none of you have been quite good enough.
Consistent, but consistently underwhelming for me.
Let's move on to 7th place. And now we have the official runner-up in the 1997 standings, Heinz Harald Frentzen. Williams' much-hyped signing, of course, the man who Damon Hill was binned off for as world champion, let's not forget. He only took one win at Imola. He finished the year with pretty much half the points of teammate Jacques Villeneuve. Ed had Frentzen up in 5th on his list. Ben and I had him 7th, which is where he's ended up. Matt had him 8th. But Matt, I am going to, as I teased earlier, I'm going to come to you first, because you were a Frentzen fan at least going into 97. I don't know how long it lasted during 97, but did your disappointment about how this went, did that play a role in him ending up so low for you?
Yeah, so during 97 itself, I stubbornly remained a defensive apologist for Frentzen, of just sheer anti-patriotism as the world went, look at this German being worse than Damon Hill. I said the world, as the UK did that.
It was Ben.
It was all Ben. I kept looking for the good in what Frentzen was doing, and at the time I found quite a lot of it. And then revisiting those theories to do this series, I realised most of those theories were rubbish. And every time I kind of clung to a bit of race pace or something, there was a reason why that was never actually going to pay off. I do think he was treated harshly over some of the kind of first lap stuff. We have had a few arguments about that in the mini series. I think there were times when the UK commentary just pounced on him as the guy who'd replaced Damon Hill and picked fault with him when they wouldn't have picked fault with anybody else on the grid. But there weren't enough bits that weren't rubbish. There were too many times when he was invisible in a race. Too many times he was miles off Villeneuve's pace. Admittedly, Williams was not as sharp as it had been, but that was still the best car on the grid. Villeneuve was a very good driver, but he should have taken a better fight to him. I know Williams and Frentzen was a bad fit, and Williams and Jordan in 99 showed what might have been possible with a guy who was very, very, very talented. But there were far too few times he showed that. Even with the bad luck, I think Hungary was the most crushing one. But in the late 90s, I had this vision that actually, yeah, Frentzen had like 10 great races in 97 that poor luck, unreliability or something robbed the world of seeing the beauty of, and now I think it's about 2.
Ed, you had him 5th, so that's the highest rank that he got from any of us. Was he there by default, like everybody else on your list so far?
Pretty much. Someone had to go 5th, and it was really difficult. You know, Frentzen didn't have a great season. There are a few things that benefited him. He got a little bit of a sympathy vote because he was going into a new team. As he's explained, he was pretty much thrown at the deep end. There was a lot of stuff he was unfamiliar with, etc., etc. He undoubtedly could have done better. His actual qualifying pace average gap to Villeneuve was a bit smaller than I expected. It's about half, just under half, in fact, so say, for example, a deficit between Schumacher and Irvine, which isn't great, but it's not terrible. Probably could have nabbed another win. Still rubbish in a Williams, but yeah, it's just somebody's got to go there, and it was with a very heavy heart I put in there. I found the top 4 relatively easy to kind of have broken away, but then the rest were just an absolute nightmare. I could have had him 5th, could have had him 10th, could have left him out entirely with a different sort of emphasis in terms of the basis of what you voted on, of what you ranked them on. So yeah, and I couldn't quite bear to put a Lacey above him. So that's probably why he ended up 5th. But nobody makes a good case for being 5th. But I almost find myself thinking, well, how could you put him there? But this is the cycle I went through. I put someone up to 5th, and I think, well, how can you put them there? I'd put them down, then someone else would move up to 5th, and I'll say, well, I can't put them there because of this, and this. And so it goes on, and the carousel stops whirling eventually, I guess.
Yeah, I can give people a bit of an insight in behind the scenes here, in that Ben and Matt sent me their top 10s quite quickly. You know, Matt's thing is that I think he tries to do it in less than 30 seconds. Ben gives it a little bit more thought than that. I'm somewhere, I try and do it as quickly as possible. I had messages for days from Ed agonizing over how difficult this top 10 was. And eventually I had to say to him, I don't really care now. You've got to send me it by the end of today, because I need to write the running order for this episode, because we're recording it tomorrow. So we did get to a point where Ed just had, and that's why I expected that Ed would we'd see some of this anguish from Ed, because had I given you another 3 weeks to put this top 10 together, I'm sure you'd come up with a completely different list and still not been that happy with it. Ben, any thoughts on Heinz-Harald Frentzen?
I didn't want to put him in my top 10, obviously, because I hate him for taking Damon's seat away from him, and that remains eternal. But I concede he was a bit unlucky in the beginning. Like, we since know that, you know, some of the stuff he was going through in the early races, you know, a bit of Williams being rubbish. He was sometimes really on it. I think he got better as the season went on, and he was kind of a bit stealthy because all the focus was on, obviously, Schumacher and Villeneuve and the title fight, and he became a lot more consistent, and you see more and more races towards the end of the season where he's kind of tripping over Villeneuve, so he's definitely doing a much better job as kind of Williams tails off. But yeah, overall, not a great season in objectively the best car. So I couldn't justify having him in the top 5 or 6. Lower reaches of the top 10 for me.
Let's move on to the top 6 then. And next up, we have a driver who 3 of us put 5th in our lists. And this person may have been the solution to Ed saying he didn't really know who to put 5th. So that's why Frentzen ended up there. Because Ed didn't include this driver. And it's Olivier Panis, who could do no better than 6th overall, thanks to Ed's input or lack thereof. What? Panis starred in the first part of the season for Prost and was 3rd in the championship behind Villeneuve and Schumacher when he broke his legs at the Canadian Grand Prix. He made it back before the end of the year for the final 3 races, picking up a point on his return at the Nürburgring and ending the year 9th in the standings. Ed, I have to start with you. What have you got against Olivier Panis?
Nothing at all. Obviously, he had a very much fractured season as well as fractured legs.
That's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, he performed really, really well. I think the main problem is he didn't get the chance to really see how it played out properly. I suspect had he not missed those 7 races, he'd have been pretty well ranked in this. So, yeah, he did 10 out of 17 weekends. So that sort of puts you on the sort of edge of whether you have done enough to be in the rankings. I tend to want people who've done a full season or close to a full season. You can miss a few maybe, but yeah, it was just not quite enough. But it's just such a shame, and it's one of the big disappointments of 97 that Panis didn't get to have the full season, because he did drive really, really well, and you'd hope that there had been one of those other Bridgestone days where he could have nicked in, certainly get some more podiums, maybe got a win, which would have been fantastic. So yeah, it's a rather mundane reason for this, but you could argue that because people weren't making a good case for inclusion.
Well, that was what I was going to say to you, Ed. You spent all this time telling us that nobody was consistent enough, nobody deserved to be in the bottom half of the top 10. And then Olivier Panis, I'd say, did enough races and made enough of an impression to help you be part of your solution to that problem.
Yeah, it could have solved it. It's just kind of the sort of framework I've always done with top 10s over the years. So I did consider quite seriously putting him in, but I thought it would be a little bit incongruous with the previous ways I've done top 10s to have done that. So yeah, prisoner of my own history, I guess. On that. Yeah,
I'd say that all you've done there is show that you overthink these things.
Well,
nobody was going to hold you to account on that.
They might. Well, I'd have known.
You couldn't live with yourself. You've tripped over your own criteria, I think, because the trajectory is enough to judge. You know, if you imagine a scenario where Panis doesn't mangle his legs and just carries on, he's going to have an incredible season. He still finishes in the top 10 of the championship, even though he did barely half the season. So I think, yeah, given so many people are underwhelming, especially in the top teams, he was like the standout Bridgestone driver. He had the season that I wish Damon Hill had in 97.
This is the thing with
apart from the leg break.
Yes, gosh, the trajectory is the key thing for me, as you said there, Ben. It's when someone misses some races, you have to get hypothetical if you're going to put them in a ranking. And yeah, Panis could have tailed off. The flaws that were going to be obvious in Prost could have become obvious. Bridgestone might have not delivered everything that it had been delivering the first part of the season. You look at what Arrows did, you look at what Stewart did, and you suggest it probably would have done this, probably would have carried on being good. And every bit of evidence from the first half of the season was that Panis would have carried on getting the best out of what Bridgestone and Prost were offering him. Actually, maybe not quite the best, because I've still got a nagging feeling that maybe there were races he could have made that last bit of difference earlier in the season, and he could have got the win already, got a step higher on the podium a few times. I don't have enough outright faith in Panis's ultimate pace to think that someone else couldn't have done a better job in that car, but he was doing a great job in it. You can't judge anything from his final races when he came back. He was still in a lot of discomfort and scared of damaging his legs again when they were that full of metal. I get that. So you have to just go, what would he have done in the middle? It's unlikely it would have been rubbish, so mark him on the first half of the season. It was really impressive with a slight... Did he get every possible bit out of that package? Doubt in my mind still.
That's the problem. Too many extrapolations and hypotheticals for my liking. You can go with that. It's not a wrong position, but that's just always the kind of thing that I've done, which is such a shame because, yeah, you're absolutely right. That first part of the season was a very strong one.
More out of his package than Frentzen, though, didn't he? So just on that alone, I think you could justify including Panis.
Didn't get as many races, though.
That's what it all boils down to.
Only just.
He's got marked down for attendance by Ed.
Yes.
I thought I was going to be really clever and add up the Panis and Trulli points to do a kind of, well, even at his lowest summer performance, he would have ended up here. But Trulli only got 3 points, so Panis would have still been ninth in the championship. Wouldn't have made a difference. Ed's campaign against the injured then has allowed Giancarlo Fisichella to sneak into 5th place in our rankings. He outscored Panis by just 2 in our combined scores. Fisichella finished his first full F1 season 8th for Jordan, picking up 2 podiums and having that memorable drive in Germany that ended with a heartbreaking puncture that ripped the back of his car to pieces. Matt and Ed put Fissy 7th in their lists. Ben had him 6th. I had him up in 4th. Ben, you're the closest to agreeing with me that Fissy was good. So how would you sum up his season?
Yeah, I think he had a couple of really mega races in an up-and-coming team. Bloodied the nose of some of the more established drivers in objectively better teams. I kind of worked out that I tried to give drivers a lot of credit back in this season because there was so much unreliability in this phase of Formula One and in this season in particular, and bad luck, collisions, incidents and what have you. And I feel like Fisichella actually could have, if things had just fallen slightly more his way, finished around where Alesi was in the points. And so I was giving him that credit back. That snuck him into the top 6 for me. I think, in a season where it was so messy and people were really struggling to be consistent, apart from Alesi, I think in a team that wasn't yet that consistent too, he was really impressive.
I'm going to have to confess, and I'm going to defend it. What Fizzy did after 97 colours his 97 a little bit for me. Because through 97, there's loads of new drivers like in their first proper season or like turning up a little bit, like Magnussen, Wirtz, Trulli. They're all kind of Ralf Schumacher having their breakthroughs. And you look at 97, you go, Fisichella is the guy from this group. He is the one who is pulling off some really great wet weather performances.
That's why I put him so high. I'm going by how I felt about him in 97 rather than what happened since.
So for me, Panis, Herbert, and Fisichella were really much of a muchness in my list. I found them quite hard to separate in 5th, 6th, and 7th. And gotta be honest, the fact that everything that happened for Fizzy after that made me think, oh, maybe he could have been better in 97 because look how many points and opportunities left on the table for the rest of his career. Maybe there was more in that Jordan. Maybe there was a bigger gap over Ralf Schumacher he could have established because it's unlikely he really maximised everything in 97 and for the rest of his career kind of didn't, apart from 2001 Benetton. I think subsequent history coloured it a bit. I also going through the series, things like realising when we did the episode that actually he caught on the Nürburgring mess. I think there were a few things where I was like, oh, actually, the pace wasn't as consistent there. Could he have actually done a bit better still at Hockenheim pre-puncture? There were a few kind of, I guess for me, little bits of evidence of the Fizzy that was to follow. At the time, I loved everything he was doing, so maybe I've been harsh, but I don't think that harsh.
I think the problem with Fisichella was it was just very, very erratic. Okay, he's a rookie. But actually, if you look at the average single lap pace judged by the fastest laps of weekends, Schumacher was actually very marginally faster, not by a huge amount. So they were similar. So that's Ralf Schumacher, obviously, and his teammate. So I thought, actually, that slightly changes the perspective. If you speak to Gary Anderson, which of course I did, he said that Fizzy was definitely the more naturally talented of those two, but he just had too many times when he went missing. Whereas sort of Ralph was always trying hard and often over trying hard and crashed a little bit too much, particularly at Spa. But I actually think if you weigh up the Fisichella and Ralf Schumacher rookie seasons, they're closer in terms of their overall level than perhaps I think people remember. I did have Ralph just sneaking into my own top 10, but I'm guessing he hasn't made this list given we haven't got to him. So yeah, I think it was a bit of you make an allowance for him being experienced, not quite a rookie, done a bit with Minardi the year before, but I'd have liked to have seen Fizzy just delivering a little bit more often in that season to have been a little bit higher. But just for sort of full disclosure on it, he at one stage did get up to 5th in my list before being shuffled back as well. So it's the same problem. Nobody's good enough for 5th.
Yeah, common theme here. It's interesting what you say about how the perception with Ralph, because I'm guilty of that perception. Ralph, I was just looking, I have the list that I wrote down is next to me, and Ralph was my token P11. He's the only other one that I wrote down who didn't get in. So 4th to 11th for the Jordan drivers is quite a big gap. But I stand by it. Let's move on to our top 4. And yes, Ed, you would be right to assume that Ralph isn't going to appear over the rest of this episode. I was amused, though, when you sent me your list, quite high up, the name Schumacher appeared without an M or an R, which wasn't very on brand for 97. That was one of those cool. I always found that cool with the TV graphics that we had M Schumacher and R Schumacher. And as I was reading down the list, I was thinking, I can't wait to make a joke asking you if he means Michael or Ralph. And then at the bottom, it just said 10, Ralph. And I was like, that's taken the fun out of that. Anyway,
nipped in, yeah.
Yes, top 4 then. And as I think everyone's kind of outlined across this episode so far, these guys were quite a long way clear of the rest on combined points. And in 4th place, we have 2-time 1997 winner David Coulthard, the man who ended McLaren's winless run that stretched back to Ayrton Senna at the end of 1993. So DC won the season opener in Australia. That was McLaren's first race in silver. He then won again at Monza. And of course, as we discussed in the series, was on course to win in Canada as well until that doomed precautionary pit stop went wrong late on. 4th seems pretty fair, given all 3 of you placed Coulthard there. I actually put him 2nd. And to very quickly justify that, it's because although he went a long time without scoring any points after the Australia win, he got the winning done. He got 2 wins for McLaren, which I always gave him pretty high stock for at the time and still do. Obviously, he was in position to win very late on in Canada. I know that there'll be a case made later on about how unlucky Mika Hakkinen was, but I will argue about Mika's near misses later on. I just think, actually, when a result was there to be taken for McLaren, DC stepped up and obviously had to give Hakkinen a win at Jerez as well. So I thought it was a really good season. You guys all put him 4th. Matt, was there any chance that he could have been any higher for you? Was he knocking on the door of the top 3, or very much a lock in 4th?
I thought I might have to defend putting him as high as 4th, given how big the margins Hakkinen had over him at some times, at some quite eye-catching times when the car was good. I thought I'd have to really heavily defend it, so I'll go with my defence still, as if you all disagree with me, even though you agree. For me, this was the season other than 2001 when Hakkinen kind of retired while driving the car effectively. When you looked at McLaren and went, I'm not sure which of these guys is going to be the top driver this weekend. And the rest of the time, when they were paired, you assumed it was going to be Hakkinen, you assumed it was going to be Kimi Räikkönen later. But this was the season where DC was equally leading the charge. And in terms of results, yeah, like you say, getting the wins done, should have had more wins. The bit that made me not think he should be any higher was that gap to Hakkinen on Hakkinen's best days. You looked at it through the season and went, yeah, both these guys are good. And then when Hakkinen put in his ultra performances and some of his qualifying margins, some of his race pace margins on Hakkinen's really good days, Hakkinen was the one you looked at and thought, okay, when this car stops blowing up, he's going to run away. You didn't think that about Coulthard. You thought, oh, these are great, scrapping, dogged, brilliant performances, excellent race drive. But it didn't have that kind of doubt over how high the ceiling could be. You kind of knew what you were getting. I loved his season at the time. I've been a big Coulthard fan when he was at Williams. I was really relieved to see how well he was delivering from McLaren. But the team was slipping away from him as the season went on, even though he was the one getting the job done in actual kind of seeing it through to the flag terms.
It's a strange one, actually, because I did have from the time kind of in my mind, Coulthard had the better season. I think if you'd asked me at the end of 1997, I'd have said that. But then once I went through it and scrutinised it, I did think, actually, Hakkinen's ahead. He's ahead in qualifying about 2/3 of the time. Coulthard's actually ahead in races a little bit more in terms of the racing laps when they were both there by a slender margin.
I love that stat. I love it when you wheel that one out.
Yeah, it's like 55% of the time Coulthard's ahead on race laps. But I think Coulthard ultimately, you can easily take you can easily have a reliability problem at one time and you knock off a few Coulthard wins and flip them round and you have a couple of Hakkinen wins. So I think the number of wins is a little bit of a red herring, because you could argue Hakkinen could have won. So Silverstone, obviously, he was close to winning. Nürburgring
only got into the lead there because of a iffy Villeneuve pit stop, let's not forget.
Well, there we go. There's lots of Villeneuve iffiness at various times through the year, so
steady. You're
always going to land on it sometime. But yeah, and Austria has to go down as that one, although given that the engine went so early,
yeah,
you can't really give him
I
that.
can't give
But
Hakkinen that one. Silverstone, I accept, although, as I say, kind of lucked into the lead. Nürburgring was obviously going very well, and the McLarens were 1-2. I accept that. We could do this in the Hakkinen part, but I guess I'll do it now. Something we have learned with hindsight is that Mika was still recovering from his 1995 Adelaide crash during this season. And I think what we saw later on in the year, when Mika really started to look like the better, faster McLaren driver, he said it was mid 97 before he started to really feel himself. But I tried really hard not to condition my assessment of Coulthard and Hakkinen with what Matt said, which is, we eventually knew Mika Hakkinen was the much better driver, and DC wouldn't argue that now. But I tried to look at 97 in isolation. I do think Coulthard did a very good job.
I think just watching it too, like as the season goes on, and we've revisited it, obviously, you can see like Hakkinen growing and gaining control of that whole narrative. I think Monza is one example of a race that Hakkinen could have won. I think he flat spotted his tyres, didn't he, in the second stint, and had to make an extra stop, and that was quite pivotal to that race falling away from him. And you've mentioned all the unreliability. He seemed to suffer from that a lot more than Coulthard, and I reckon, with a bit of generosity, you could probably credit him 40 more points than he actually got. So I think it was quite established by then that Hakkinen was the top McLaren driver, even discarding the fact that he was still recovering from his accident. I normally, when I do a top 10, place a lot of emphasis on a guy beating the other guy in their team. That's why I had a big gap between Fisichella and Ralf Schumacher, for example. Even if it was a close fight, I think you get a lot of credit if you're the top guy. Coulthard comes high up into this because everyone else underperformed so badly through the season, and he was one of the most consistent ones. Really racy, great starts, and actually one of the closest, what I would call number twos in a team in this season. But I couldn't have him as high as second because I think Hakkinen was just objectively better.
And did have some weekends where he really struggled for pace as well, particularly in qualifying. So it's it's interesting. I think the trend of the season is quite important in deciding between those two. But it's not like Hakkinen's miles away ahead of him. It's still quite close. But I think when you kind of dig through it, I'd have actually really liked to have Coulthard ahead of Hakkinen, because that just
should have done it then, like I did.
Because that feels like, that just shows you've done your proper due diligence and gone through it. You're not just going with what you think the natural order is between them. And then you go through it and you realise, actually Hakkinen was a little bit better than Coulthard over that season, which is a little bit frustrating. But you've got to go with what your findings say, I guess.
Let's move on to the podium then, and you may not be surprised to hear who's next. It's the man we've just spent most of the David Coulthard entry talking about. It's Mika Hakkinen, the man who, of course, would win the next two championships after this one. He, of course, ended the 97 season by being gifted his first career win, but he'd been close before, as we've talked about in the DC section. Retired from the lead at Silverstone and the Nürburgring. There was the opening lap at the A1 ring, but who knows what would have happened there. A nice even split, though, here, as Ed and I put Hakkinen third in our list. Ben and Matt put him second. We'll try not to reappraise the McLaren driver dynamic from the other side of the garage, because we've kind of already done that. So let's focus very much on Mika himself here. Ed, was he in the running to be any higher than third for you, or did that feel like quite a nice fit?
Third seemed about right, because as we discussed, there were a few caveats about the first part of the season, etc. So, I sort of thought about it, but he was never a big threat to break into the top two for me.
I'm gonna go to defending a McLaren driver mode again, this time with some reason, because obviously I've put him higher than two of you have. For me, it's because Coulthard was so good so often that Hakkinen ends up second in my list, because I was really impressed with Coulthard, and then when you look back at the season as we did during the series, so often Hakkinen is absolutely miles faster than him in qualifying, and then a long way ahead in the races where Hakkinen has his bad luck. And he's just quicker. That's the big selling point for me. And he gets ahead of someone we haven't yet talked about by doing fewer daft things. Maybe he would have done more daft things if the engine hadn't blown up before he had a chance to, but I doubt it. He was just fast. Your impression from the whole of 97 was, wow, this guy's ridiculously quick. Now he's well, you didn't know he was fully fit, but it felt like he was kind of finding his feet, like something was coming together as the car got good, as the engine got good. It was like, now Hakkinen's in the top car. he can release this extra 10% at the top, and okay, everyone else needs to watch out because this guy is insanely fast. And that was my overwhelming impression at the time. And as a Coulthard fan who was so impressed with Coulthard's race pace and elbows outness through the season, I had to just go, yeah, my guy's not as quick as this guy. This guy's quick.
Yeah, you could look at the unreliability element and go, well, okay, that means we didn't get to see enough to justify putting Hakkinen so high. But I've gone for the more generous interpretation, which is that, you know, extending the incredible pace he was showing, particularly as the season got towards the late stages. I just think he would have won a lot more if the McLaren and particularly the Mercedes engine had been more reliable and actually been kind of nudging into the title fight potentially if he'd had a Jean Alesi season. If he'd had a Jean Alesi season in terms of reliability and consistency, he's kind of the inverse for me. He was consistently impressive rather than underwhelming. And yeah, maybe it's a stretch to put McLaren right in the title fight because, you know, there was a lot still going on. They're still building up. But yeah, he was one of the most unlucky drivers I felt in the top group in the championship. And as Matt outlined, the pace and the lack of mistakes for me. Okay, he missed a lot of racing laps because of the unreliability. So maybe there would have been more mistakes, but I kind of think not. I think we were seeing a delayed rise of Hakkinen because of everything that went before. And he had a really tough challenge to beat Coulthard as well. He had one of the tougher teammates performing really well in the kind of nominal number 2 role. So that just edged it for me because in a season of massive errors from everyone, he was one of the least error prone, I thought.
I do think first half of the season he went missing a few too many times on like slightly iffy Goodyear days, but you could say that of Alesi as well. And yet Alesi, like you say, was so
I think
consistent.
McLaren struggled early in the season as well, didn't they?
McLaren looked confused a lot of times why suddenly one car was third and the other one was 18th or something. And it was all tyre related. But
okay, let's move on to the top 2 then. In second place, for some reason, we have the 1997 world champion. I have to say, unsurprisingly and disappointingly, Jacques Villeneuve has ended up coming out second in our combined scores. But it was very close with our number 1 for reasons we'll outline later on. Matt and Ben put Villeneuve third in their lists. Ed put him second. And perhaps predictably, I put him first. But there'll be a bit more justification for that when we get on to our next entrant. So, Ben, you can kick us off. I know I'm not going to like the majority of this segment. I might just leave the room. Why was Villeneuve only third for you?
Well, he made heavy work of the championship, I feel, in the best car. And also his Japan... I'll wait for Glenn to put his headphones back on.
Were you giving a Patrick Head nonsense story? Is that what I heard?
No, I don't think so. He did make heavy work of it, didn't he? The Williams was the fastest car. I don't think it should have gone all the way to the end, but it did. I think some of his wins were a bit fortunate. You know, Silverstone, Hungary, Austria, Nürburgring. I don't think he should have been winning those races. He benefited from just unreliability, bad luck for others, particularly McLaren. And
I'm going to come. I've already said this once about Silverstone. Silverstone and McLaren is in the lead because Villeneuve had a 30-second pit stop.
Yeah, okay.
So as we discussed at the time, the luck evens out.
Okay, well, I'll scratch that one, but the other 3 still, you know, that's still 75% of the ones I mentioned. He was still fortunate.
So you're giving Hakkinen Austria
correct.
because he led about 0.9 miles of the race.
He was going to win that race.
Nonsense.
I'm convinced. And there's a temptation, I think, with the way the season played out. You know, Schumacher obviously gets excluded and blah, blah, blah for what happened in Jerez. But I'd forgotten until we revisited the episode how badly behaved Villeneuve had been at Suzuka. And for me, that kind of levels out the moral victor element of who was better in that regard in the season. So at that point, I feel it's more of an objective comparison between who got the most out of their machinery. And I don't think you can make that argument in favour of Villeneuve, even though he got the championship just about over the line.
There were just too many days where he wasn't very good. Literally, just the Montreal shunt, the being completely nowhere at Hockenheim. They were just. I wanted to put him higher. I was delighted as a 17-year-old when Villeneuve won the championship. I loved Villeneuve at the time. I still think he's underrated in history, genuinely, on the basis of like 96 and probably 2000 as well. But his actual championship season, and my suspicion over the years that he was just too wobbly, and I was biased at the time, has grown and grown. And then we go back through every single race in detail for this series, and I'm completely convinced. How many times during 97 was Villeneuve genuinely actually good? Obviously, he was good enough times to win the championship, and that's why I put him as high as third. But I did wonder if I'd even put him as high as third. There were too many that I didn't let Alesi near the top 10 because Alesi's rubbish moments were so rubbish. Villeneuve's rubbish moments were as rubbish as Alesi's rubbish moments. And he redeems himself with the manner in which he makes it all happen at Jerez. But there just weren't enough other genuinely impressive days. Glenn, you're right about Silverstone. That I still, at the time and ever since, I've thought the whole Hakkinen narrative there is forgetting that Villeneuve kind of had that race sorted before the pit stop. But just so many other underwhelming or genuinely not good days.
Ultimately, even in the best car, it does take a lot to win a world championship. So that's in the credit column for him.
Where was Heinz-Harald Frentzen? We said earlier, half the points in the same car.
Yeah, he battered Frentzen. And Villeneuve he was capable of some remarkably good driving. You know, he had that stiff car set up. He was quite brilliant to watch at times in terms of the pace he extracted. But he was erratic. There were too many mistakes. And for me, when it came to the ranking, it came down. He's a distant second, let's put it that way. Because I think he just put together far too erratic a season, which is why it would have been really interesting had Hill still been in the Williams in 97 and to what way that would have gone, because I think Villeneuve would have not been able to get away with dropping the ball so many times and stupid things like the yellow flag thing at Suzuka when he should have known he needed to be on his best behaviour. So, yeah, it's a fragmented season for Villeneuve, but we shouldn't let the fact that he did make errors and there were poor weekends blind us to the fact that he did win the championship. He did ultimately at the end go toe-to-toe with Schumacher and live to tell the tale. And he did deliver the goods, albeit a little bit later than advertised, and perhaps he delivered the goods into just the wrong place, like next door or something, not quite on the money, but got the job done just.
Yeah, but too many rubbish weekends for a champion. Rubbish in France, rubbish at Monza, just too many, just qualifying 5th or 6th and not really doing anything in the race. Rubbish at Spa. You know, there was a lot of Williams mess, particularly pit stops and what have you, and some unreliability. But there's also just times where you think, "Oh, what is Villeneuve doing?" You know, not grabbing the race by the scruff of the neck like Schumacher can, particularly in the mixed conditions.
I think Williams also lost a little bit that year through not having Newey there, just having the sensible pragmatism of a Newey in terms of getting the most out of that car, because of course he was on gardening leave, and I think that might have changed things a little bit, because there were some, as I referred to, some interesting setup directions Villeneuve went down that I suspect Newey, if he'd been there, might have been able to head off at the pass, as it were. So, I mean, ultimately that still means that's something that Villeneuve was making hard for himself, but it's also something Williams as a team as a whole maybe could have done a little bit better as well. But it was certainly the fastest car, wasn't it? And I think if you put a certain other driver in that car, it would have been an early title clinch, let's put it that way.
Yeah, this is a good point for me to bring up the time that I put my theory to Patrick Head that, Newey not being there, because he was kind of marched out of Williams. It was ordered not to go back to work at Williams by his lawyers in, I think, like November 96. He wanted to finish the 97 car. His lawyers said, no, if you're challenging your contract to get out of this team, you can't keep turning up for work. But when I said to Patrick, oh, do you think Williams it maybe didn't help not having Adrian, and maybe car development would have been a bit better and all that? Patrick, very dismissive, was like, oh, we didn't really develop cars back then, which I thought was nonsense. Or maybe that's why Ferrari caught you up as the year went on. I was going to say, to avoid more Villeneuve bashing, we'll move on to number one, but inevitably there'll be more of it. But let's get on to number one. As you've probably worked out by now, it's Michael Schumacher. So our top driver of 1997, apparently, is someone who wasn't even officially classified in the championship. All three of these idiots put Michael in first place. So if you're wondering how it could be close between him and Jacques, as I said earlier, it's because I didn't include him. I will explain myself before we let these guys come in and the Schumacher fawning starts. It was partly deliberate, and I assumed all three of you would subscribe to the wasn't Michael brilliant that year narrative that I've had to put up with in professional and personal life for the last 27 years. Used to hear this in the Autosport office all the time. So I did think that I'd maybe tactical vote against him, and it nearly worked. But it wasn't just that. I also took the view that if you get excluded from a championship, then why the hell should you be included in the best drivers of the year, let alone be considered the best? You got thrown out because of something you did as a driver. And to rail against the narrative that Schumacher was some sort of god this season, something that I think most people boil down to performances in the wet at Monaco and Spa, and the Patrick Head comment about Villeneuve made hard work of this title, which, as I've said several times, including in our 97 Revisited series, that comment overlooks Williams' own role in making hard work of this championship. I actually also think, so I am bringing it back to, Matt said earlier, when you look back at this season, the depth that we have, it gives you a fresh perspective. I actually got some of this on Schumacher from going back through all the races. I think he went missing slightly by his own sky-high standards at a key point in the season. Over the first 11 races of the year, his average qualifying gap to Eddie Irvine is 0.8 seconds. Then we move to the final 5. I've got rid of Spa because of rain and stuff, so the gap's massive. The gap on average over the final 5 is 0.3 seconds. That's okay once Ferrari turns up with its bendy front wing at Suzuka and they're up the front and Schumacher's back on the pace. But in the races where this title challenge supposedly unravelled because the Ferrari was meant to be hopelessly uncompetitive, so we're talking Italy, Austria, Nürburgring, Schumacher qualifies 9th, and 5th and was only 0.3, 0.0, 0.0, and 0.5 ahead of Irvine. So this massive gap to Irvine disappears just when he needs it, but we all just put it down, you all put it down to, the car's not any good. So right when it's getting down to crunch time, everyone accepts the narrative that the Ferrari went rubbish, when actually I would argue Michael didn't step up when the circumstances called for it. The championship was there. He was leading the championship. It was his for the taking, and suddenly he could barely out-qualify Eddie Irvine. That's my case made. I don't really care which one of you speaks first on this. Matt, I guess you can start.
Thanks. That's such a tenuous argument.
No, it's not. If that's all you've got, we'll end the episode here. Come on, say something more constructive.
I can't believe that's what you're hanging it off.
Oh, so now we're all Eddie Irvine fans, are we? Spent the whole year bashing Eddie Irvine. The moment he qualifies close to Michael Schumacher, it's a tenuous argument.
It's still not close, though, is it? Not really close. Like 0.3 is still, that's a solid margin. I will let you have the fact that I don't think those races where the Ferrari was not so good was Schumacher's greatest, but that's a blip when you look at the rest of the season. And my overwhelming argument for Schumacher, it is Monaco, it is Spa. It's the fact that there were still days when his margin was completely ridiculously huge. Just like proper, like, I am so much better than everybody else on the grid. And you can look at tyre choices a little bit in there. You can look at car setup choices. But we're talking multiple seconds per lap around circuits of that driver challenge level. And for me, it's just like, no one, at the time, 27 years ago, Glenn, I would have done exactly the same. I'd have been so up in arms about what he did at Jerez that you can't even consider it. Well, he should be allowed on the grid next year. He's been so evil and wrong here. 27 years on, I'm more chilled out about that. I was very like Nigel Roebuck column influenced at the time and just seeing evil in everything Schumacher did. Yeah, Jerez was terrible and a real blot on his reputation. And what a shame that in that crunch point, he chose to do that. But that doesn't outweigh all the times in which he looked so commandingly the best driver on the grid. And it's the bits where Ferrari is kind of pretty good and Schumacher is there relentlessly qualifying so close to Villeneuve or even out qualifying sometimes. I'll absolutely let you have that the autumn bit of the season, you could probably make a case he should have got more out of that car in the bit where he suddenly started turning up on row 5 and not really making stunning progress in the races or being wiped out by a load of Jordans. But that's such a minor part of the season compared to everything he did to get the car anywhere near the championship in the first place, and the days when he just made everyone else look like they shouldn't be in F1 by comparison to him.
I want to tip my hat to Glenn for that argument he made, though. You said it was tenuous, but I think it was articulate, well-reasoned, and passionately argued.
Oh God, where's this going?
It sounded like therapy.
The one problem you've got, Glenn, is it's the argument of a world-class defence lawyer in a trial where there were hundreds of eyewitnesses, it was caught by multiple cameras, the evidence is overwhelming. So I commend you for the spirit with which you committed to it. But
that's all I want.
So I think you've done very well there. But the big problem for you was that it was very, very clear that Schumacher was at a considerably higher level than Villeneuve. But I admire you for finding those little cracks to pick away at.
I had to go down swinging, didn't I? I couldn't just do a Ben and go, yeah, my guy was rubbish, but I can put him in the top 10. That's not loyalty.
Yeah, so you get credit for that. I think that was a more impassioned defence than possibly could have been achieved. But sadly, the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. It's a unanimous jury verdict, and they're not going to take long to deliver it.
So I can't make a late call to put Damon Hill number 1 in this top 10 based on some.
If it
furious
bumps Schumacher down, do it.
I'll just exclude Schumacher and Villeneuve on moral grounds now, and then that opens up at least a spot for Damon to go into the top 10. I'm quite happy about that.
And Ralph Schumacher.
I think that the one argument that you can make if you want to, and people did at the time, for example, in Autocourse's top 10 done by the late great Alan Henry, he put Villeneuve first and Schumacher second, and it was basically on the basis of Jerez. I think that's overkill personally, but if
Jerez would have been very raw at the time that list.
But well. If you want to say he got excluded, he overstepped the mark, it was well beyond sporting acceptability, etc., I will accept you can make that argument. I personally wouldn't. But I think that's the one basis on which you might be able to do it. And a lot of people did make that argument at the time. I think I look at it as a whole season of performance, and I think there were things that, Villeneuve at Suzuka, for example, interfering with the racing when he was banned from is a little bit iffy as well. So, yeah, I think that's a credible enough argument, but I think it's a little bit reductive. I think that's the only basis on which you could successfully argue, because you can't argue with it. You can say, well, I think that it's completely beyond the realms of what's acceptable, therefore throwing him out, a little bit like the championship. And you think, well, okay, heavy-handed, but if that's your position, so be it. You can argue it if you want, but yeah, I certainly don't subscribe to that.
I'll give you the Schumacher going missing a bit towards the end. I had the similar thought when we were revisiting those later season races, but I feel like the number of those, they kind of even out with the number that Villeneuve went missing. So that kind of is scratch for me. And then on the moral side, yeah, okay, Schumacher got thrown out, Villeneuve didn't, but they were kind of treading on similar murky ground, I think, over the course of Suzuka and Jerez. So for me, those two things.
Villeneuve didn't use his car as a weapon, though. It was just a roadblock. Well, there's a slight difference.
It depends on
didn't try to drive into anybody.
Depends on your definition of a weapon. Maybe a defensive weapon. But those two things kind of cancel each other out for me as well, as I said before. So all
you're making is a case for them being equal.
Well, apart from then, it's like, well, look at the rest of the season and who gets more out of their machinery, who outperforms their machinery on occasions. And it's Schumacher, isn't it? That first part of the season, it's not just the sort of wet peaks that Matt outlined. It's those races where he's kind of just relentlessly chasing the Williamses, scoring podiums when the car's not working, or France when Williams looked completely lost and Schumacher's just kind of bossing the race. I don't think Ferrari were quite the slick unit they would become at this point, and Williams were much more together, Newey accepting. And I think Schumacher just kind of unravelled them a bit, just with the force of his talent, if you like. It wasn't a perfect season from him, wasn't a perfect season from anyone, but I think his season was closer to perfect than Villeneuve's was, regardless of the exclusion.
Nobody's taken the championship down to the wire in a Ferrari other than Michael Schumacher in '97. That's the way I'd look at it.
It's a good point. I hadn't realised, I'm sure I knew at the time, that Alan Henry had given Schumacher number 2 in Autocourse. And obviously I was aware that a lot of the journalists I admired at the time were strongly anti-Schumacher after Jerez. And like one of you said just now, it was so raw at the time, and it was double raw because it made you, well, two elements. One, it made you look back at other things Schumacher had done and remove the benefit of the doubt. Adelaide 94, some of the 95 driving, although, and I think in the next series at Bring Back V10s, we'll be arguing passionately about Spa 95, and I'll defend him in that. But it made you think, oh, okay, this is his default. Those times when I thought, maybe not. No, it was. And it was relatively soon after Ayrton Senna had done all the things he had done. And so I can understand the Formula One press at the time going, oh, great, our last two legendary drivers, when it comes down to a crunch moment, are willing to do this and to feel that other drivers earlier in history wouldn't have done. So I can totally get the enormous weight of Jerez 97 at the time. And maybe on moral grounds, we should give it a Glenn level of weight. But I think, Ben, you said overkill, and I agree with that. And I don't think it outweighs everything else that season. Like you guys have said, it's not just the wet wins, it's the dry performances were so strong in the first 3 quarters of the season.
I don't know about Brazil and Argentina, but anyway, I will keep going. Let's end the episode before I have another rant. I'm genuinely sad to say that this means our journey back through the entire 97 season is now officially over. This has been so much fun. It's one of the best things I think we've ever done here at the race. It's spawned a MotoGP equivalent that Matt's going to be looking after over there as well. I'm so grateful to everyone in our members club that's enjoyed it so much. It was us trying to think of what else can we do for the members? What can we do that, in all honesty, isn't too time consuming to put together? We've all probably put more time into it than we anticipated when we came up with the idea. It's been really well received, so we're definitely going to do it again in the future. I guess before we go any further, though, we should just quickly revisit the final top 10. So let's do that. Let's refresh everybody's memory. In 10th place, we had Rubens Barrichello. In 9th, we had Johnny Herbert. 8th was John Alesi. 7th was Heinz-Harald Frentzen. 6th was Olivier Panis. 5th, Giancarlo Fisichella. David Coulthard was 4th. And our podium of drivers for 1997 was Mika Hakkinen in 3rd, Jacques Villeneuve in 2nd, and Michael Schumacher number 1. As I've mentioned then, we will be doing another one of these next year. All 4 of us are going to nominate a season that we would like to do. And then we're going to have a vote on Patreon sometime during season 11. So we'll be plugging that in the series 11 episodes. And then it'll be up to you guys to decide which season will next get the revisited treatment.